Gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really want to follow up on the committee chairman's remarks. He's absolutely right. In 2011, 2012, I was actually very intimately involved in the process of trying to update the AUMF and have all the bruises and scars to show for it. It is a very difficult process, and the main thing I want to accomplish in my 2 minutes here is to explain to everybody why we haven't updated it, because there's actually very clear reasons. I'm not sure they're good reasons, but they're very clear. Everyone sort of acts like, well, we just haven't done it. Why are we, twiddling our thumbs? The reason is because, well, of lawyers and how words are interpreted. And as we went through and tried to word it exactly correctly, and as we negotiated with the Senate, we discovered that basically no matter how you word it, two groups are going to oppose it for diametrically opposite reasons. One side is going to say it's too broad. The president way too much power for too long a period of time and gives him too open a hand. Other groups will look at that exact same language and say this unfairly restricts the president. It's going to make it more difficult. And you have these conversations, those of us on the committee have, with the Pentagon as they're trying to figure out. I haven't had as many conversations with the current administration as with the previous, but I talked at length with the Obama folks about deciding what could they do, where could they commit a strike, against which groups. And it was a very lengthy process to go back through and try to figure out whether or not it was under the law allowed. So if we change this, the lawyers on both sides are going to go bananas, saying that this new language proves that you can't do that or it's too broad. Now, all of that is not to say that we shouldn't do it. We should. But I just want people to understand the difficulty of it and for our House to actually be willing, and the Senate, to do the work we should do. Don't kid yourself that this is something, well, gosh, we could just do it and it would be easy, and if everyone understands it, we're ducking it for no good reason. It's going to be really, really hard. It's going to take bipartisan, bicameral cooperation, but it is way past time for us to do it. And yeah, when we do it, lawyers will interpret it. There will be some uncertainty, but there is uncertainty now as they try to, as the chairman described, bootstrap the 2001 AUMF onto a whole bunch of other things. We have an obligation. I'm good. We have an obligation to do this, even if it is difficult. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
I thank the Speaker. I want to commend both the Chairman and the Ranking Member of the House Armed Services Committee for their approach to this problem. It's well known in this body that probably the House Armed Services Committee is the most bipartisan committee that we have. And the fact that you have tried in the past and the fact that you're willing to work with it today is deeply appreciated. I also want to thank my friend from Massachusetts and want to associate myself with his frustration. He has every right to be frustrated. My friend from the Ranking Member is correct. This is a difficult job. It will require bipartisan cooperation and bicameral cooperation, but isn't that what war is about? To achieve a national consensus? And I think that's exactly what Secretary Mattis was asking for. We will go do any mission that you, as the Congress and the administration, ask us to do. But give us a clear mission and give us your absolute support in carrying that through. And if we have this debate, there will undoubtedly be dissenting views. That's what democracy is supposed to be about, too. And so my friends that would oppose the use of force, for instance, in Afghanistan, that voice ought to be heard, and that case ought to be made. And frankly, those of us that are supportive of what we're trying to accomplish against ISIS need to make our case and persuade the majority of this House and of the United States Senate to move forward. So I take this as the first step on a road. I'm like my friend, it is a baby step. I would agree with his characterization, but at least it's a step. And this couldn't have happened without the cooperation of our leadership in the House, certainly without the help of the chairman and the ranking member of the committee, but also couldn't have happened without the persistence of my friend from Massachusetts. And we have worked together. And believe me, that's unusual. We don't agree on a lot of issues, but we respect one another. And this is also a question of congressional authority. I think it's a profoundly important constitutional issue. And I do believe we have inadvertently, because of the difficulty of the task, allowed war-making power to slip away from us. That needs to stop. We're responsible to the American people. The Constitution is very clear about where war-making power lies. And frankly, it ought to be difficult to go to war. It ought to demand cooperation. It ought to be something that we think is worth setting aside our differences, working together, because we are asking men and women to risk their lives. We're putting them in harm's way. They deserve to know that we are 100% supportive. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr.
Gentleman
Chair,
from Massachusetts recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the Cole Amendment. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank the gentleman from Oklahoma for his work in pushing Congress to have a debate on an AUMF. I had offered an amendment as well to the defense bill, along with Mr. Sanford and Mr. Moulton, that would put in place a new consolidated AUMF, and I wanted to describe it. I know there's been considerable debate over whether this is the right bill for an amendment of this nature. But what we have tried to do in this language is avoid the red lines that both parties seem to have in this debate. And as I perceive those red lines, my friends on the Republican side of the aisle are reluctant to, in what would be considered too restrictive a way, tie the hands of the Commander-in-Chief by putting limits on geography or the introduction of ground troops. On the Democratic side, we are resistant to the idea of giving the Commander-in-Chief too much of a blank check. The way that we have sought to navigate the distance between these two red lines is a resolution that would repeal the old authorizations, which no longer really apply to our current situation, replace it with an authorization to use force against Al-Quaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban and their associated forces. It would place no geographic limits and no limits on the introduction of ground forces, but it would have these necessary safeguards. First, it would have a sunset date of 3 years so that we don't, again, get to a 15-year period where we can't on an authorization and it goes on beyond its intended life. But it would also provide that if a president decided to introduce ground troops in a combat mission, a privileged motion would be in order that any member could trigger, where within a discrete period of time set out by the War Powers Act, you could compel a vote to either approve or modify or repeal the existing authority. That would, of course, not prevent us from taking a vote at any other time, but it would at least allow a vote and some accountability. So I commend that for people's consideration as a way that we might navigate the distance between the parties, and appreciate again my colleague from Oklahoma's efforts to get us to weigh in and consider and live up to our constitutional responsibility. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to advise my friend I'm prepared to close whenever he is.
Well, I think we were expecting a couple of other people, but they're not here, so we'll close. We will.
I can talk about this a long time. So.
I always enjoy hearing you talk about this when we agree on things. It's always pleasant. Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the remaining time. Again, to simply commend the gentleman from Oklahoma for this amendment, because I think it's important that we move forward, even if it is a small step forward. As I said initially, I mean, I'm frustrated. I know Mr. Schiff is frustrated, and a lot of other people are frustrated who had amendments that were perfectly germane to this bill that I think should have been debated, and many of us think they're long overdue. 16 years in Afghanistan is an awful long time, and some of us fear that these wars are becoming endless, and they're essentially on automatic pilot, and we don't give the attention that I think is appropriate to what is happening, especially given the fact that so many brave men and women have their lives on the line on behalf of our country. But beyond that, this AUMF in Afghanistan that's now been going on for 16 years has also been used to justify what we're doing in Syria, what we're doing in Iraq, in Somalia, and I go on and on and on. I mean, this is ludicrous. And as the gentleman from Oklahoma knows, before we began to get sucked in militarily in Syria, some of us tried to have this a debate on an AUMF in Syria, because we thought the time to debate an AUMF, the time to debate military action, actually should be before we get involved. because once we're involved, it's a lot harder to have these debates.